Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to the Andrew Tate Show, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We've got a great show for you guys today. We're going to be covering the Big Ten and the SEC's possible demands with the CFP, the latest on FSU and the ACC trial, and make sure you guys stick around for segment 3 and 4. We're going to do something a little bit different today, where we have a special segment on dating horror stories. But before we start, I just wanted to ask that you like and follow the show. We get a number of questions from the viewers that come in during the show, so to ensure that your question gets read on the air, I ask that you use the tips and donation link with your question. The tips and donation link is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. This puts your question at the top of the list so that I can see it, and it also just really helps the show. Also, we have a guest today, Tommy from the GSMC College Football Podcast. So, you get one more person other than just your regular me and Tate. So how are you guys doing today?
Is it me and Tate, or is it Tate and I?
Tate and I, me and Tate, whatever.
What was that, Thomas?
I've walked into a little bit of an argument here, but
Oh, can you hear him, Faith? He kind of broke up a little bit.
Yeah, I got him. Yeah.
Okay, I was just making sure. Okay. My first question, first off, welcome to the show. We're excited to have you. I just want to make sure we're calling you by the proper name. Are we calling you Tommy? Are we calling you Thomas? Am I calling you by your government name or your name on the streets?
Let's roll with Tommy. That's what I do on my show. So I think Tommy's probably best.
Okay. Yeah, we're all about that street cred, Faith.
Just as long as he's not calling you Becky,
Yeah, you do not want to be called Becky. And you don't want to be Miss Peachtree either.
No, definitely not.
You don't want to be Miss Peachtree.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, let's just dive right into it. So, big topics these past couple of weeks. It really just seems like nasty, divorce between mom and dad on both things, honestly.
It's a soap opera. It's
really
matter of fact, it's the best soap opera in sports right now.
Yeah.
Only thing it's missing is a baby's mama. And then
So the Big Ten and the SEC could demand several things as these meetings keep going on. Wednesday is shaping up to be one of the most significant days in history of the college football playoff. The 11 members of the CFP Management Committee will be tasked with hashing out the structure of how college football is going to look for most of the next decade. With no resolution is expected on any single issue, this will be the meeting where everybody puts their cards on the table. It also stands as the first meeting involving every conference since the Big Ten and SEC basically staked their claim to the future of the sport by forming an advisory group earlier this month. Tate and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I mean, it's a complex situation that you could honestly talk about for days and days and days.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm understanding things. When you were talking about meeting Wednesday, you're talking about this past meeting that already happened, right? You're going to, okay. Sorry, I was just clarifying. I was like, what?
Yes,
wait a minute, they're meeting again? All right. So Thomas, this thing has just gotten crazy. I understand, politics and everyone, jockeying for a position to get what's best for them. It's unfortunate in many cases because I know that some of the proposals on the table is the crazy one is a 12-team playoff where the Big Ten gets 4 schools, the SEC gets 4 schools, the ACC gets 1 school, and the Big 12 gets 1 school. And then the rest of college football fights for 2 spots, including Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. It's kind of disappointing because this whole playoff thing, it could have been the thing that everyone wanted, where everyone could have been included. I have been saying this for years. I wanted it to be a 16-team playoff where all the conference champions, the SEC, the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, the MAC, Conference USA, all of them, every conference got one at-large bid. There's 10 conferences, and then there were 6 at-large bids. Everyone would be included. All the blue bloods would be included. All the top conferences would be included. But we didn't get that. We have a, just flat out, political war where everyone's just kind of gone to their corners and they're saying, my stick is bigger than your stick. And the SEC and Big Ten are saying, like, listen, we're going to work together. We got the 2 biggest sticks of them all. So we want it all. And I don't think when you're really looking at this, they're looking out for what's best for the fans. They're looking out for how can they make the most money and how can their conference be represented best instead of what's best for the fan. I thought my approach would have been the best one, but nobody gives a care about what I think. But you know what I mean? Every conference having their conference champion in, and then the 6 at-large bids, I thought that would have been the best model. What do you think about what's been going on?
First of all, the idea of the 10 auto bids is very interesting. I hadn't heard of that before. To be honest, when you look at what the SEC and the Big Ten are doing, obviously it's not the best thing for the sport. I don't think anyone can necessarily argue differently, because one of the great things about college football that's been there for as long as I can remember is the regionality, the different styles that happen in different parts of the country, and the being able to play the teams in your state, the teams that, you have neighbors that are fans of those teams. And obviously a lot of that has been lost with the conference realignment, and then the playoff obviously expanding has created kind of this, almost like this arms race in college football where you no longer have necessarily the time to worry about the sport as a whole, because there are people up top that are prioritizing money so much and putting so much towards the top conferences, whether it's TV deals or, just the SEC and the Big Ten kind of run the sport, and they have for quite some time, really. I mean, when you look at the overall quality of play in those 2 conferences, it's obviously, a little bit above the rest of the group, and it has been for quite some time. I think since the playoffs started, if it was a 12-team playoff from the start of the playoff, they would get about 7.6 playoff bids per year between those 2 conferences. So there is this argument to be made from their point of view that they deserve more, right? If they're playing the best football, they want to be well represented in the playoff at the end of the year. And I think a lot of this obviously started when Texas and Oklahoma decided to go to the SEC, because it then created earnest on the Big Ten to keep up, right? The SEC had always been looked at as kind of the big dog, and then adding, Texas, who's a huge brand, and then Oklahoma, who's had all this success throughout their history. It put more earnest on the Big Ten to add teams that have that same thing. And then when the playoff comes into all of this, you have these 2 super conferences that have been pushed by each other to create better and bigger product. And then this is what happens, I guess.
You said it started with Oklahoma and Texas. I say it started way before that. I think it started when the Big Ten took Nebraska.
Yeah.
I think that's when it actually started, right then and there. That started the arms race right there.
Yeah.
And once that happened, then it set the dominoes in place for what was going to happen next with, Texas A&M and Missouri. And then it's been kind of like a big arms race between these 2 conferences ever since then. And, I understand why they're doing this, because I think the largest domino has yet to fall. And that is, if Florida State gets their way and they can break that granite rights, it's going to be a flood.
Mhm.
And these schools, those ACC schools, are going to flood into three conferences. The top teams are going to be divided up between the Big Ten and the SEC, and the Pittsburghs and the Syracuses of the world. Maybe the NC States are going to end up in the Big 12, and it's going to be by ACC.
Mhm.
I mean, that's my spec. We're all speculating here.
Yeah,
And then you hear another proposal that I saw this morning that was brought to the table was 4 teams for the SEC, 4 teams for the Big Ten, 2 teams for the Big 12. But I never heard anything about what they were going to do with the ACC. If the Big 12 gets 2 teams and there's 8 teams between the Big Ten and SEC, what happens to the big mega pack 2, pack the Mountain West, the American, and all those guys? They're done. They're out of this.
Yeah, that's the big thing. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier. I think this sport slowly is becoming more about the powerhouses of the sport. And for a long time, at least from my point of view, what made this sport specific and special in its own way was the MAC teams, the Conference USA teams, the Sun Belt teams, all these teams that you don't necessarily see on your TV every single Saturday, but they play very specific styles. They are very different, and they have a very intense fan base in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
Because they're a smaller school, because people identify with that so much. And I think over the last, and even a decade, like we talked about, or more than a decade since Nebraska joined the Big Ten, there's been more of an earnest on the Power 5, and then now the Power 4, and I have a feeling soon the Power 3, and then so on and so on. But I think one thing to keep in mind, especially with this playoff stuff, is they had planned to go into this season with a 6+6 format with a 12-team playoff. They've already changed course on that. So
wrapped it. Yep.
The question is, I guess, if Florida State does win out, which I tend to believe they will. Now, I'm not a law expert or anything like that, but I tend to believe Florida State will find a way out of that conference. Then I'm sure they'll come back to the table and find a new deal. So I think it's a very interesting thing, because we're talking about all the new developments in the playoff and all the changes that are going on throughout the landscape. And all of this could be, scrapped in 2 months if the ACC falls apart, or it could be scrapped in a year if Florida State finds their way out in less than a year. So the playoff committee, I think, in some ways kind of showed their hand to the SEC and the Big Ten and to kind of everyone to say, we're amenable to what the landscape looks like, and what, the people that run the sport, the commissioners and all of those people think is the kind of landscape of this sport. So the Big Ten and the SEC, from my position, are obviously the power brokers in the sport, and obviously hold a lot of the cards in this situation, but it's only going to get bigger, right? The cards that they hold are only going to get bigger if they add a team like Florida State, or they add a team like Clemson or North Carolina or Virginia. So there is this worry that all of this stuff that is slowly pushing towards a new era in college football, which doesn't look like college football too much to me, is only going to get exacerbated more when Florida State finds their way out of the ACC and they eventually, dissolve. Because if you ask any Pac-12 fan, it can happen very quickly, where your conference was right there and then it's gone the next day. So I think the ACC it has to be all hands on deck in that office right now. It has to be everyone focused on keeping Florida State on board, because if they, let them leave, the entire conference.
And I was going to say, I'm going to have you hold that thought, because that transitions right into what we're going to be talking about next. I'm going to toss it back to Faith. You can give your last words on what your thoughts are before we, go to our next fun topic.
I agree with what Tommy said, saying like the Big Ten and the SEC are basically like kind of the powerhouses of college football, and a lot of the time they do end up in the playoffs. But for me, like, it doesn't seem really fair, because what if some of these other like smaller tier conferences have like up and coming like really good teams, and they're not even going to have a chance to really go into that college playoff if it's set to the way like the Big Ten and the SEC want it. So, you know.
Yeah, it makes it incredibly hard for everyone loves the dark horse. And that's the Boise States back in the days, Utah, having Cincinnati in the playoffs, things like that. When you're starting to look at a playoff when there's 8 teams gonna be, from one conference, it stacks the deck against them incredibly hard.
And even if they were to get in, they would probably have to play a home game in Athens or in Clemson, South Carolina, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and then they're really up against it. So it's all a mess.
Yes. All right.
Yes, it is. All right, guys. Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the latest on FSU and the ACC.